The one thing that I would urge you to do before you look at news stories is to remember that there's a couple of things going on. One is the impression that the administration is trying to give to the American people, and that is that they are very, very strong and that resistance to what they are doing is futile. And the other is whether or not what they are doing is legal. And let me explain what I mean by that. So one of the things that you saw, I think it was yesterday, was Trump taking control of the Washington, D.C. Metropolitan Police, and the movement into Washington, D.C. of National Guard troops and troops from a number of the different pieces of the government that answer to the Department of Homeland Security. And that's important. I hope I remember to tell you why that's important. And he is doing that by using a couple of I don't want to call them loopholes, but things that are written into the home rule law that gave residents of Washington, D.C. the power to have some control over their government. Because Washington, D.C. is different than any place else in this country in that it is overseen by Congress. The Constitution gives Congress control over the District of Columbia. Now, there's a big fight about that. A lot of people, including me, actually think that the District of Columbia ought to be a state. It ought to have representation, and that the actual amount of land that Congress controls should be smaller. But the reason that we got a District of Columbia controlled by Congress is actually many, many years later, a little bit amusing. And that's that when the Congress under the Articles of Confederation was in Philadelphia, and the soldiers for the Revolutionary War were furious because they weren't getting paid. The soldiers actually went and started pounding on the doors of Congress and saying, "Hey, dudes, hand over the cash." It's not literally what they said, but there was real concern that they would do that. And the lawmakers turned to police officers and said, "Hey, you got to protect us." And they're like, "Actually, we're on the side of the soldiers." So that's why it is written that the Washington, D.C. should be overseen by Congress so that they would be able to have control over things like that. Anyway, so there is in that the ability of the president to commandeer the police force for up to 30 days if he chooses to do that. And, it's a pretty sweeping power, although theoretically Congress should sign off on it. Congress is now out of session. I'm sure that was part of the calculation that went in there. Not literally out of session. They are not currently in attendance there. That actually matters too. So the reason that it matters that it's the people from the troops that respond under the Department of Homeland Security, things like ATF, for example, is because that part of the government is very new. It's a product of the war on terror. And as a result, it is not covered or does not currently consider itself covered by the Posse Comitatus Act. Now, the Posse Comitatus Act, you're going to hear a lot about, not only from me now, but you're going to hear about it from a lot of people, but also I'm going to write about it soon, because the Posse Comitatus Act is a really interesting part of our history. It is a law from 1878 that says that the government cannot use American troops against American citizens. And originally it was written only to apply to the U.S. Army, but the other branches of the U.S. military have said that they consider themselves covered by it. Department of Homeland Security has not. All right, that's why that matters. It's a lot of like in the weeds stuff in the government. Anyway, the reason that we got that law in 1878 was because in 1877, the U.S. government under President Rutherford B. Hayes used the military against strikers on a number of the major railroad lines in the country, primarily the railroad line of Thomas Scott. And Thomas Scott was a railroad baron who had been instrumental in making sure that Rutherford B. Hayes got the presidency in 1876, although he had not won the popular vote. That went to Tilden. And so the fact that Hayes is inaugurated in March of 1877, and in July of 1877, he uses the U.S. military to protect Thomas Scott's interests. A lot of people were like, hey, this is so not okay. and they end up using the Congress ends up passing the Posse Comitatus Act and saying the government can't use the military against American citizens. And during those debates, actually somebody says to the people who are proponents of that law, do you really mean that you can't use the government against, what happens if somebody elects a socialist to become a mayor of a state, of a city, which had recently happened in Pennsylvania? And the guy said, yeah, we mean the government can't do that. And so that's what the Posse Comitatus Act is. The exception to that is domestic insurrection. And the government has called out troops in times of what it considers domestic insurrection, both in the 19th century and in the 20th century. So that's what the Posse Comitatus Act is. Just a little bit of a rabbit hole there to add is it's one of the things that really made life for indigenous Americans extraordinarily difficult in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, because the people who were intruding on their grazing lands, for example, or who were running off their cattle or their horses were U.S. citizens, and the people who were supposed to be protecting indigenous Americans were the U.S. Army. And so the U.S. Army by law could not be law enforcement officers against those American citizens who were intruding on Lakota land, for example. And that's why you get the rise in that period of indigenous police forces that work with the U.S. government. Sometimes people misunderstand that and think that they were somehow sellouts or whatever. That was literally the only way that the Lakotas, for example, and other tribes as well, had any protection against the Euro-American interlopers onto their land because of the Posse Comitatus Act. All right, you're going to hear a lot more about that, but that exception is going to be important going forward. The reason I just went into all that is because although Trump and the administration are trying to make it look like they are controlling the federal troops to go after American citizens on the streets of Washington, D.C., in fact, their purview is very narrow. What they are trying to do is make it look like they are all powerful, when in fact, they are operating under a very slim and possibly illegal, because of the circumstances under which the administration can take over the police, for example, that requires an emergency. And while Trump has insisted that there is an emergency in Washington, D.C., the crime there is at a 30-year low. Which suggests this isn't an emergency. And just for the record, the Republicans have actually just taken $1 billion away from law enforcement, among other things, in Washington, D.C., literally defunding the police. So the idea that somehow there's an emergency that has to be answered with this militarization will be challenged in court. Now, the reason that I can say that this is what they are trying to do to create this image is because in California right now, there is an ongoing court case about the use of troops during in June and July in Los Angeles, which you may remember on July 7th, there was the real use of American troops in MacArthur Park to really make it look like the troops were bearing down on American citizens, along with ICE in MacArthur Park. And that has been challenged, and there's a court case going on about it right now. And one of the things that the administration is saying is that, yes, they believe that the soldiers should be covered by the Posse Comitatus Act, and that they were there to make a federal show of force, that this was about image. Now, they are being countered with the reality that they might have said they should be covered by the Posse Comitatus Act, but they were actually doing the sorts of law enforcement activities that they should not have been doing under that act, and that's what the court case is about. So, but they've made it very clear that this is what they were doing. They're trying to look really impressive. And the other aspect of that is of some interest is that this administration has been consistently fighting court cases, not based on the merits, but on aspects of cases that are simply sort of the mechanics of a case. That is, what they are arguing is that they're in the wrong court, or that so-and-so doesn't have standing, or whatever. Not that what they're doing is actually wrong. They're trying to obfuscate a lot of what's going on. All right. You need to have in front of you, because you're seeing people talking in all sorts of places about Trump having declared martial law, everything is over. In fact, that's not the case. Washington, D.C. is a special case. And even within that special case, there are a lot of limits. That's not to say it's okay. This is deliberately designed to make people afraid of the administration, to make them less likely to speak out. But it is not, nobody has declared martial law. Martial law means, among other things, that people don't have the right to due process, among other things. That hasn't been declared in Washington or elsewhere. So the reason I mention that is because one of the things that's really clear right now is that the administration is trying to look like it's extraordinarily powerful, and it's not. Hi, folks. Welcome back to History and Politics Chat at 4 o'clock on Tuesday, where I try and give some context to the history behind the news and what's actually happening in it. My name is Heather Cox Richardson. I'm a professor of history, but when I do these conversations, I do not speak for my employer. All right, so let me get to the questions that got crashed out by thunder and lightning last week, where I warned you I might get lost, and I did. In fact, you heard that giant crash, and we lost power for about 4 hours. Don't worry, I figured out it wasn't coming back, and I went kayaking. So, and just when something like that happens to me, in any case, I live in the woods. It's not at all uncommon for us to lose power. Most of us have generators, and in the winter we heat by wood. So we're unless you hear otherwise, I'm safe. I'm just using a candle instead of a light switch. All right. So there's a bunch of questions today, and I wanted to start with one that is more applicable, I think, today than it was last week, and that is that. A number of people have asked about what's going on with Social Security and disability insurance, and what does it mean to say that those are potentially in danger? And the answer to that, as I've talked about, I think before, is that Social Security and disability insurance are funded, Social Security entirely, and disability insurance in part. They're actually both funded by trusts, and the money that goes into those trusts is different. So Social Security depends entirely on what I'm going to tell you about, and disability depends in part on it. And those are funded by payroll taxes. And payroll taxes are literally that. They are taxes that come out of your paycheck. So you have to be working for this to affect you. And if you look at your pay stub, these are the things that show up under FICA, the Federal Insurance Contributions Act. So that's a FICA payroll tax, or if you are self-employed, it comes out as SECA, Self-Employment Contributions Act. And the way it works is that when you get a paycheck, the federal government takes a portion of that money out of your paycheck and puts it toward Social Security and in part toward disability insurance. And then when you need those things, you draw on them. Okay. So, what's happened and what went into place today, so they're paid for by payroll taxes. You would bring that money home if it didn't come out of your paycheck. And for FICA, your employer matches that. So if you put in, and I'm making these numbers up, if you put in $5, they put in a sum of money as well, usually $5 as well. And if you're self-employed, you have to pay both sides of it. And that's because that's the way the law is written, which is kind of hard on people starting out new businesses. So if we got rid of those payroll taxes, you will take home more money. And that's the argument behind getting rid of payroll taxes. And that's why President Trump does not like payroll taxes, because he doesn't like that it means that both that you're going to take home less money, which you could have in your pocket and then use to jumpstart the economy, and that that employers don't have that money either, because they're the ones who have to put in their side of things. Today, which is September 1st, what went into effect was one of the executive memoranda from, actually the term is officially memorandums now. I don't know, believe me. But anyway, is one of the executive memorandums from the beginning of August, when President Trump got frustrated because the Congress was not, and his negotiators, Steve Mnuchin and White House Chief of Staff Mark Meadows, were not able to come up with any kind of a coronavirus bill. And he just said, well, I'll take care of it. And he did that through 4 instruments, 3 memorandums and 1 executive order. The executive order had very little by way of teeth, by the way. But anyway, he can't change the law. What he could do was delay collection of the payroll tax. So beginning today, employers do not have to collect payroll taxes. Now, but here's the trick. The law still stands. So what he's done is he's deferred the payment of those payroll taxes into 2021 with the idea that if he is reelected and Republicans are in charge of Congress, they will make that cut legitimate and permanent. So the idea is that he's deferred the taxes with the hope that the law will change and that will all go away. If that doesn't happen, though, those taxes are still going to have to be paid. And so let me move that back to the present. Today is the day that memorandum went into effect. But real question, are employers really going to defer the collection of that tax? Because it's going to be a nightmare. What are you going to do? Say to people in January of next year, oh, oopsie poopsie, we're going to go ahead and claw back all the money you were supposed to pay last year. Or are they suddenly going, and then they're going to have to put in a big chunk. And that will, of course, have required, since most people are paid by, not everybody, of course, but since so many people are paid by direct deposit, and it's all computerized, you got to reprogram everything possibly twice. So it's not at all clear that that's going to go into effect. I do think it's interesting, if you have checked, that the Dow has the Dow Jones Industrial Average, which is one of the ways that people measure how well the stock exchange is doing, has jumped dramatically today. The day that this payroll tax cut was slated to go into, not tax cut, deferment was slated to go into effect. All right, so that's what's happening in the short term, right? In today and over the next couple of months. But why does Trump want to do that? And this actually bleeds into something else that somebody asked. So I'm going to run with it right now, and that is that I know it often looks as if the Republican Party is, especially under Trump, is doing stuff really willy-nilly. And it's very hard for a lot of people to put those things together. Like where's this payroll tax cut come from? And why that? And why do we have corporate tax cuts? And why is there drilling in the Arctic? And why, and sometimes it just seems like it's mean-spirited. And obviously, I'm not going to editorialize here. I have ideas about that. But let me explain to you what they are trying to do. When somebody like one of the 4-letter guys, I think both of them actually, Rand Paul and Paul Ryan. As I've said before, I have a hard time when the words all have the same number of letters in them. And then you got the father in there too. Anyway, when they talk about getting rid of Social Security and getting rid of Medicare, and when people talk about getting rid of Obamacare and that's the Affordable Care Act that provides exchanges on which people can buy health insurance that does not discriminate against pre-existing conditions, for example. When they talk about these things, a lot of people look at that and they say, of course, that's never going to happen. Who would put up with that? That's Americans love those things. Why would you do that? Well, why you would do that is part of an ideology that has had a lot of popularity in America over our history. And most recently, of course, it was the ideology in place during the 1920s. And afterward, there was the reactionary group of people who hated the New Deal, hated a new kind of concept of what the government should do that went into place during the 1930s and the 1940s, and said this was going to pervert American society. So what does this mean? What it means is that if you, people like the people who believe in the kind of ideology that I'm going to talk about, known now as movement conservatives, but they were mainstream Republicans in the 1920s, They weren't after World War II. But what they believed was that there was that capitalism and democracy went hand in hand, and that if the government regulated business, if you had a business, and I'm going to use the male pronoun here because that's really what they're talking about when they talk. The reality, of course, on the ground is very different. Women have businesses and all that, but when they talk, they're talking about men for the most part. So if you're a guy who has a business and the government comes in and says, you got to pay your workers a certain amount of money. You can't work them that hard, as you're working them. You can only work them for 8 hours a day. And you have to give them time to have lunch. And you have to give them weekends off. And you can't have machines that are going to hurt people. So one of my great examples about this is that, the word to mangle, like you mangle something, that actually comes from the machine called a mangle. And a mangle was something that was in laundries in the late 19th century and early 20th century. And by the way, you can go online and you can search. You can still buy a household mangle. Somebody actually left me one in her will once. And another word for it is a linen press. It weighed 16 gazillion pounds. And believe me, there was nothing in my house that was in danger of being mangled. But so I was very happy to let somebody who badly wanted it take it. But what that is, a mangle was a piece of superheated metal, and it's a whole machine, but the pieces that matter are a superheated piece of metal and a roller that held onto that metal really, really tight. And what you would do if you worked in a laundry, or if you had one at home, the ones at home now have brakes on them, like a chainsaw would, so they're safe now, but they didn't have that in the 19th century. If you were working in a laundry, you would push the clothing, especially sheets, in between the hot metal and the pressure of the mangle, and you'd push that in, and it would emerge fresh and clean and without seams in it. I mean, without wrinkles in it. But the problem was that that machinery in the 19th century and early 20th century had no protections on it. So it would, if you push too close and you got your fingers cut, your arm would get dragged into the machine and mangled. It would get destroyed. I mean, in that extraordinary heat and pressure, your arm would get torn off, basically. So anyway, to go back, so that's where we get words like mangle. All right, so let me go back though to that ideology, and that ideology is that if you start to put those sorts of restrictions around a business owner, saying they have to pay a certain amount of money, or that air has to be filtered in a certain way through the factory, or they can't dump crap in the sewers, what you're doing is you are limiting what they can do. You are attacking their liberty. And the reason that matters in this ideology is that freedom matters, of course, in the democratic system, because a man needs to be free in order to vote freely and therefore elect people who accurately represent the body politic. But it also means that in order to do those things, in order to put the guard on the mangle, in order to clean the air in the factory, in order not to work people all for 15 hours a day or something, it's going to cost money. It's going to actually cost money. It's going to mean that people are going to have to spend money on air filtration systems. They're going to have to upgrade their mangles. They're going to have to actually invest money in ways that they do not choose to do. At the same time, how are you going to guarantee that those things take place? You're going to have inspectors. And those inspectors are going to come around and they're going to say to people, your air's not clean enough, or you're dumping sewage in the streets, or whatever. And what you are doing then is you are taking, this is going to matter, by the way, in a minute, you are taking money from that businessman and you are giving it to the government. And that government, in turn, is hiring people who are going to take that money in their paychecks, who are going to be overseeing the business people. And therefore, the government is actually intruding on the liberty of that individual businessman. All right. So if that's the case, there's a couple of things going on. There's the problem of regulations, which is really what drove people like in the 1950s, people like William F. Buckley Jr. or Barry Goldwater in the 1960s. There's a problem with that, but then there's this other problem that starts during the New Deal. So regulation is a huge deal in the 1890s and the 1900s, but during the New Deal, there's another problem for people who are concerned about business and about the links between democracy and capitalism. And what they look at is the policies of the government after the New Deal or during the New Deal that actually provide programs to level the playing field, the economic playing field in America. So programs, for example, that try and stabilize the agricultural product going onto the market. Programs that provide jobs for jobless people. Programs that try and guarantee basic wages. Things that are in place to level the playing field. And the problem with those, from the perspective of somebody who doesn't like them, is that those cost tax dollars. Those literally are going to take money out of the pockets of people who have money, and they're going to put it into programs and into people to enforce those programs for people who don't have money. So these things are literally a redistribution of wealth from people who have money to people who don't have money. All right, so in America, I hope, by the way, this is interesting. I actually love the ideological piece of all this. Obviously, I suspect you're going to hear me in a second. I'm not defending this. I'm trying to explain this because there is an ideological basis for it. It is a coherent ideological argument. It really is. It's one that there is a countervailing ideological argument to be made, and I'll get to that in a minute. But I just want people to understand, so often, you hear, and I've had this conversation with somebody recently going, Trump will never cut Social Security. And I said, well, yes, he will. Now, he may not get it through Congress because the Democrats have a very different way of looking at the world. But this is ideologically coherent with going ahead and opening up the Arctic, for example, for exploitation by oil companies. Because what you want to do is you want to free up business. Now, why do you care so much about business being able to do whatever the heck it wants, which is basically what I have just described? You want that because you believe that the way the world works is for innovation to be let loose. That if in fact you let men do, when they're talking about men, you want people to be able to do anything they want to do because that's how you innovate. That's how you move the ball forward. You take people, let them rise to the top, and then you make sure they have all the running room they need. And as they do that, as they begin to accumulate money, as they get better and better at what they do and build bigger and bigger factories, they're going to run the country more and more efficiently, the way Andrew Carnegie did, for example. The idea there is that, what you're really going to do is you're going to turn these people loose and you're going to let them go. And the inherent in that ideology is the idea that most people really aren't like that. I mean, most of us are really kind of happy just doing our jobs and not innovating. And you don't really want us in charge of the country because we're going to get all bogged down. It's going to turn into a muddle, and there won't be any of this driving force that this ideology promises to release into society. So when you look at things like, why would you cut Social Security and disability insurance? The answer to that is because if you do that, what you're going to do is you're going to get rid of those taxes that are redistributing wealth from hard workers, these innovative guys, and distributing it back to people who just weren't good enough to figure out how to organize their lives in such a way that they needed money. All right, so there is an ideological argument behind it. Now, here's the other side and why there is this ongoing struggle in America between these two sides, between that ideology and the ideology that I'm going to describe. That ideology was one that the Confederates, the big planters, not the small planters in the American South before the Civil War, who tended to enslave one, maybe two people, and to work alongside them. I'm talking about the entrepreneurs, the guys who had, large plantations. Maybe many of them, like Wade Hampton III, had 5 plantations, all of which he worked, of course, with enslaved workers. And interestingly enough, when people like Hampton did that, they had this ideology that said that the white guys running things, were the hard workers, and that the people actually doing the work, and mind you, the work of a plantation, you shouldn't think of a plantation like a farm, which many people do. Think of it as a town, because the enslaved peoples in a plantation are not only hoeing in the fields, they're shoeing the horses, and they're building things, and they're cooking, and they're doing everything that makes things work. But to the large planters like Wade Hampton, they think that they are the ones responsible for that success because they're the ones directing it. And they begin to articulate this idea, and they're the first to articulate it, but it gets picked up again for various reasons. Was there a big jump there in various reasons, just so you know. But for various reasons, in the 1880s and the 1890s, in the American urban centers and in the American West. And what people argue is that, you could really make America work great if you could just get rid of the idea that there should be regulation, that there should be any kind of leveling of the playing field in America between, in the late 19th century, white Americans and African Americans. That's one of the things that really is a burr under the saddle of people who want to free up this liberty, is the idea that the federal government is trying to protect the equality of opportunity for African Americans after the Civil War. That's really when all this is articulated. And in the 1870s, people who object to Black rights increasingly talk about this redistribution of wealth, and they call it socialism. They insist that this is socialism. I want to be really clear here. This is not 20th century socialism. It is not. It is not. They get the word in that early period from some of the social reforms of the 1840s and the 1850s, when everybody's calling everything socialism. There is not yet any kind of articulated governmental system of socialism that is going to get such notoriety in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. But in America, we have brought these two things together under the same word, socialism. They are not the same. Anyway, in the 1870s, people who are opposed to Black rights begin to talk about how Republican efforts to level the playing field amongst white people and Black people is actually a form of socialism, because what it does is it permits lawmakers, and some of them are Black, but mostly it's just that they are willing to work with Black people. Most of them are white. They're going to put lawmakers in power who are trying to level the playing field, and that's going to cost tax dollars. And in the 1870s, they're really concerned about tax dollars being spent on things like roads and schools and all the contracts that those things are going to cost. They're worried about it in the South amongst Black people. They're worried about it in the North amongst immigrants who run the cities and say, we kind of need, schools. So you get in the 1890s, again, this idea that if only you could get rid of those things, America would thrive. And finally, in the 1920s, after the landslide election of 1920, when we get the election of Warren G. Harding, which is itself a really interesting election, in part because of how we got there, and in part because Harding is kind of a placeholder. Harding's Alice Roosevelt said, he wasn't a bad man, he was just a slob. And he himself said, this position is way too big for me. So it's funny that people turned out in a landslide for Harding, but what they did is they also put the Republican Party, which is at the time was the group that embraced this ideology, into power in the White House so the executive branch, and in both houses of Congress. And what they did is they said, this is great. We're going to do this now. We're going to get rid of all that regulation. We're going to get rid of attempts at social welfare that were put in place in the 19-aughts and the 19-teens. We're going to really free up the world for business. And that's the period when you get people like Herbert Hoover at the Secretary of Commerce and Andrew Mellon at Treasury going ahead and really taking the reins of society, and where you get the legend that Calvin Coolidge, who is going to step into Harding's shoes after Harding dies, probably of a heart attack out in California. What you get looks great. I mean, if you look at the 1920s, the way they are portrayed in the newspapers and the magazines, they look just ducky. And people like Calvin Coolidge say, you know, he doesn't actually say this, he says something close to it though, the business of America is business. And what their argument is that if you really free up businessmen to do their thing, what you're going to end up with is this world where you have freed up innovation, you have freed up people to make radios and nylon stockings and refrigerators and toasters and new clothes and Chris-Craft engines, Chris-Craft boats and cars and radios, and everybody's standard of living is going to increase, and everything's going to be just so great that you don't have to worry about inequalities in society anymore and the fact that some people don't have access to things. Now, the reality, of course, was that was all an image. But the argument was that if you just could do this, get rid of these people carping on how you needed to have regulation and needed to have social welfare programs, you really could make society boom. Well, of course, the whole thing comes crashing down in October of 1929, and you have the depression, the ensuing depression. And at that point, you get the rise of this other ideology put into place by Franklin Delano Roosevelt, a Democrat, along with the aid of Democrats and progressive Republicans, by the way, from the West, during the 1930s, and then really taking off during the 1940s in order to fight World War II. And what this new ideology says, it's a really interesting ideology because it's really seat of the pants. I mean, I'm going to make it sound like they knew what they were doing, but the reality was that literally FDR says, hey, well, let's try one thing. If it doesn't work, we'll try something else. And they're constantly experimenting to see what actually works and what doesn't. And I'm going to come back. I hope I'll remember to come back to that in a bit. I'm going to write that down. So what they do is they experiment, and they realize that in order to make capitalism and democracy both succeed, you really can't have unregulated capitalism. Because what that does is it enables those few people, the first people out of the box, to go ahead and not only to have a great business, what they're going to do is they're going to monopolize resources, and then it's a really weeny step to them actually taking over the governmental system and using it to solidify their own economic power and then their own political power. So you see this dramatically in the 1880s and the 1890s when you have these guys like Carnegie who came to America, as a bobbin boy. I mean, he was poor. He was an immigrant from Scotland. He actually came on a ship called the Wiscasset. A little bit of trivia there. With the Wiscasset, the Mid-Coast Maine used to be a major shipbuilding area, and Wiscasset was actually not one of the major ports, but obviously somebody knew somebody. Maybe it was built in Wiscasset. I don't know. I assume it was built out of Bath. But I just love that he came on a ship that was from Mid-Coast Maine, or at least named after somebody in Mid-Coast Maine. Anyway, when he came, it was possible to go ahead and rise the way he did, as he did. But those moments when people can really just do anything are few and far between. We've seen it in the .com rise and fall in our own era, but before that with computers and Bill Gates. If Bill Gates were my son today, he wouldn't be able to get anywhere because that field is crowded now. So anyway, what they discovered with people like Andrew Carnegie was that he did work his way up, but then he made the mistake of thinking that everybody else could. And one of the things that and I shouldn't pick on him so much because he was less bad about it than other guys were, they begin to think that the way you run society is to protect their interests. So for all that people at the top of this system kept talking about doing it on their own, what they did is they took over Congress, and they managed to organize the economic policies of the country in such a way that they all funneled money upward. So this, in the 1930s, FDR and his people recognize this, and they begin to figure out ways to level the playing field. And they do so really deliberately. What they say is that in order to protect democracy and to protect capitalism, both things that FDR cared a lot about. Now, at the time, people who opposed him called him a socialist. They said he was destroying America, and he kept saying, honey bunch, I made that up. He keeps saying that he is protecting capitalism and democracy, and he's very articulate about that. And I'll tell you more about that in a second. But he says, if you continue on this path of just turning everybody loose to do whatever they want, what's going to happen is you're going to end up with fascism, because fascism is a new idea about government that's developed in the 1920s under Benito Mussolini in Italy after World War I, when he's like, why can't we get socialism going? We can't get socialism going because people are weenies. I am paraphrasing, and you can't. They don't know what's good for them. So those of us who do know what's good for them have to take them in hand and make the move in one direction. And FDR looked at the rise of fascism and worried a lot about something similar coming to America. So what he tried to do was, if you will, to file the sharp edges off of capitalism to go ahead and protect democracy. And in order to do that, who's going to stand up to, the major figures in America in the 1920s? Nobody is big enough. Like, no worker is going to sit there and be able to take on a Rockefeller. So the entity that has to stand against those big guys is, in fact, according to FDR, the government. And you put the government in place with a nonpartisan civil service, because you don't want people working just for you, because then it's just a question of every time the government turns over. If you have a big government, you have to be really careful to make sure it's nonpartisan and the people who are in it are loyal to the country, not to a man. But if you construct this nonpartisan civil service, what you're going to do is you're going to make sure the government protects equality of opportunity across the board, and at the same time that will itself protect democracy, because nobody's going to be able to buy an election because everybody's going to be worth sort of the same amount, and everybody's sort of going to be okay, as opposed to a few people taking everything and keeping everyone else down. And we have, in the period between 1933, when FDR takes office, and 1981, when Ronald Reagan takes office, we have something that economists call the Great Compression. And that means that wealth and income in America start to compress, or actually do compress, and there's not that much difference between the very rich and the very poor. Before that, it was huge, then it gets compressed, and then we get the Great Divergence after 1981, when those things go whoop again, and you end up with money moving dramatically upward. So the whole time that Reagan and people after him talk about socialism and communism being a redistribution of wealth, because of that first ideology I talked about, in fact, wealth is dramatically moving upward in that period, not moving downward. So we have now in America one of the greatest splits in income that we've ever had, and we have much less economic mobility than most other developed nations. Now people don't believe that. They think there's real hope in America to move up. But the reality is, because of the way our laws and our social system based on those laws is constructed, that is no longer, that's a dream. It's no longer the reality for most Americans. All right, so to take you back here to what's going on with the payroll tax and with Social Security and disability insurance, you might look at those things, as I do, and say, we need those things to file the sharp edges off of capitalism. Because if we don't do that, what's going to happen is all the money is going to move to the top, and we're going to have a huge number of people who are not in that less than 1%, who don't believe in the system. They don't believe they're getting anywhere. They're going to be extremely dangerous, either by attacking the system for economic reasons, or by attacking the system by grabbing hold to some kind of ideology that offers them hope. some kind of religion, for example. And I have compared and do compare the rise, for example, not entirely, but the rise of QAnon as this a religion, if you will, that addresses what's going on right now with this sense in America that people at the bottom can't possibly rise. They need something to tell them they know something that nobody else does. So you and I might look, or I'm sorry, I don't mean to speak for you. I look at Social Security, disability insurance, education is even more special than that, but roads and schools and all the things that I think we need to make society function. I believe in what was known as the liberal consensus, the New Deal, the idea that the government has a role to play in regulating business. It has a role to play in saying, no, we don't want to develop the Arctic, or no, we want to protect the Grand Canyon, or no, you can't pour crap into the air and we need clean water. I believe the government has a role in regulating business and in regulating workers' hours, protecting workers, and that it has a role in providing a basic social safety net, so that people have Social Security insurance, they have disability insurance, they have unemployment benefits, and that the government should also invest in infrastructure, which also costs tax money. But not everybody believes that. So when people say there's no way Trump would take on Social Security, yes, he would, because that fits a different ideology. Now, the problem for modern day Republicans is that they've supported people by convincing them that that taxation actually only benefits people of color and feminist women. Of course, that's not true. But the problem is that most Americans actually like the things that the liberal consensus provides. They like bridges that stay up. They like clean water. They like clean air. Mind you, lots of people want to argue about what that looks like. You may not like the regulation that, you got to paint your lobster ropes purple in order to protect the right whales. I hear a lot about that. You might not like that. And I might think that's great. I don't actually have a dog in that fight. But most of us think, even though we disagree with what the government should actually do, we think it should do something. These other people don't think it should do anything, and that by having it do things, that is actively hurting the country's ability to move forward. So that's probably more, I want to say it's more than you wanted to hear about, because what I just did there was I talked about Social Security, which people were interested in, but I also talked about why some people might want to get rid of some of the programs that most of us think are really good. Why would you want to get rid of the Affordable Care Act? You would want to tweak it for sure. You might want to rewrite it. But the idea that Americans should have health care when every other developed country in the world does, why is that in any way controversial? It's controversial because there is this other way of looking at the world that says the minute the government starts to do these things, it's going to cost tax dollars. And when it costs tax dollars or regulates business, it is hampering liberty and making it impossible for entrepreneurs, a few wealthy entrepreneurs, to really take off. Now, interestingly enough, I keep saying the word entrepreneurs. In fact, people starting out businesses like the liberal consensus. So one of my favorite pieces of information here actually comes from one of my readers who I met this way. He's a Securities and Exchange Commission lawyer. And he always likes to point out that we get securities, the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission, not because leading businessmen wanted it, and certainly not because little poor people wanted it, because who knew what securities even were. We got that because people trying to get onto Wall Street, trying to start businesses, recognized that they couldn't break into any fields unless the playing field was level. If you had the head of the stock exchange picking winners and losers, for example, it wasn't a question of whether or not you had a good idea. It was a question of whether or not you had cocktails with the guy. And so they wanted the playing field to be held level by a third party, by the government, in order for entrepreneurship really to flourish. So that is what's going on with all of those things. All right, I have probably bored you all to sleep, but I love the ideology behind this stuff. Okay, so let me get to some other things here quickly that speak to this. So here's a problem, and I'm going to see if I can tie this in as well. So here's a problem for people who believe in getting rid of this liberal consensus, the idea that the government, small L liberal, the idea, I've talked before about how we get liberal as an epithet, the idea that government should regulate business, provide a basic social safety net, and promote infrastructure. So there's a real problem for people who oppose that, because Americans like that. You know, they think that's what we're doing. They like that. They want that. So what are you going to do? Well, you need to control the media that people see. You need to make sure that people are not hearing that you're actually going to destroy things they like. That you need to hear another version of that, the idea that in fact taxes are bad and the government is bad and all that has to be taken down. And the problem with that is that Americans have never agreed with that. I mean, there's certainly things we all don't like. You can probably make a list as long as your arm of programs that you would get rid of. But there's a list as long as your other arm that you would keep. So how do you sell that? Well, you sell that by limiting the information that people can have, by limiting the media. You also sell it, by the way, by manipulating the vote, which I may or may not get to. So what does that look like? Well, it looks like what I wrote about in the Letters from an American last night, simply promulgating news stories that are false. I mean, I thought it was really shocking. That's not the letter I wanted to write last night. I actually had another letter halfway done about the legal things that are going on right now. And I kept seeing these tweets that were just lies. And if you have to lie like that, if you have to change the words of a man who has lost his voice to a disease, like where are you? Yeah, I mean, that where you are is you're at a place where you need to manipulate what people understand to be the truth. Mind you, we all make mistakes, and politicians all spin. That's the way it's done. But this is to a new level. So that's one angle of how you manipulate that. But another angle of how you manipulate people into supporting you when you're going to attack things they care about. And by the way, I don't adhere to the false consciousness idea, which is a theory that comes out of the left, the intellectual left. I actually don't adhere to that. If anybody is listening to me and thinking, oh, she's a Marxist, I'm not a Marxist. I actually come at it from a very different angle, from linguistic theory, and from history and from Eisenhower and Eric Hoffer. You've heard me talk about him before. But the other way you do that is by silencing journalists. And so now I'm going to go to another question. And of course, I'm sure you saw that the White House tweeted the other day that it's keeping folders on, especially David Farenthold, who has been very good about following down where money goes when it goes near the Trump White House. And they said we're keeping a file on him. And we know as of about 3 years ago that there is an organization, at least that there was then an office in the White House that was keeping dossiers on people that they considered to be social media influencers and journalists, which is very disturbing. But this brings me to another question here by Marianne Ryan. And she says, are there any updates to the Voice of America story that I talked about before? And that, if you recall, was that the head of Voice of America and her deputy both resigned when the White House put in charge of the Voice of America, which is a series of media products. They put in charge of that a guy named Michael Pack, who was an associate of Steve Bannon's. And it was pretty clear that Pack was going to go ahead and try and change the way that Voice of America covered stories coming out of America, primarily stories that did not, that were ones that Donald Trump didn't like, primarily about the coronavirus. That's what really upset him most, was the fact that Voice of America was critical of his handling of the coronavirus. So he gets put in place, and I wrote about that, and I wrote about the fact these people stepped down, and a lot of people were nervous about it. But when I wrote, there had at the time been no obvious changes to the Voice of America. So and Pack insisted he was going to be good. He did do a fairly clean sweep of some of the offices, but it looked as if things were stable. And I don't know about you guys. I'm always suspicious of everybody, but like a lot of people you're suspicious of, but they end up coming through. That's kind of how it works. So like putting Senator Marco Rubio in charge of the Senate Intelligence Committee after Burr stepped down. I'm not a huge fan of Rubio, but he has a pretty good reputation about being honest in terms of intelligence. And so, yeah, when the Fifth Senate report came out last week, which I am going to do a big post on, I've talked about it, I'm going to do a big post on it. He said, it has nothing in it, which was a complete lie. It's a bombshell. But he did bring the thing out, so you got to give him credit. So anyway, this with PAC, I was kind of like, well, let's wait and see. I don't like the look of him on paper, but who knows? Anyway, here's the rest of the story. As Marianne Ryan asked. So one of the things that the Voice of America has done is that Voice of America employs journalists from around the world. And in order to employ those journalists from around the world, they get visas. And they get visas to go ahead and live in the U.S. and work for the Voice of America. Under PAC, he is apparently permitting the visas of the more than a dozen journalists who have come to America to work here for the Voice of America. He is letting their visas expire, which means that they are going to have to go. I mean, they haven't expired yet, so maybe he's going to step in. Maybe he's just thinking this over, but they're going to have to go home, and that sounds like it might not be a huge deal, except the fact that many of them will be going home to places where their work for Voice of America will endanger their lives. So why do you do this? Why does one do this? Representative Elliot Engel, who is the chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, has complained about this, and he has insisted that they explain what on earth they are doing. But shockingly enough, the Voice of America under PAC and the White House are ignoring him. Usually it's routine. You just have a routine visa renewal. And there are roughly 80 foreign journalists for the Voice of America. And right now, 16 of them, their visas are expiring. So, so why does one do this? One does this to silence journalists and to harass journalists and to make it clear that if you are going to stand against Donald Trump, or if you're going to write against Donald Trump with this ideology that he embraces, you're going to be in danger, that the government will not protect you and you will be sent home. So if you do that and you manage to get rid of any journalists who are critical of the Trump administration or of this ideology that the administration embraces, what you end up with is a sanitized media that is essentially propaganda. It's a state media. Now, the leap here, not really a leap, one of the things, if you're watching what's happening in Belarus right now, where there's a turmoil going on, one of the things that has happened under the pressure coming from Putin and the Russian regime is ... they're expelling all the foreign journalists, which is a huge deal. So what that means is what happens in Belarus can't really be reported on or overseen by people who are not in danger of from the Putin's heavy-handedness there. So what's happening in Voice of America continues to be very disturbing. So there is your answer to that, Marianne. All right, so there's a couple of quickies here I will do, and then I will maybe get to some of these others. Diane Gage wanted to know why on earth the DNC used Donna Hilton in a video, because Donna Hilton was a woman who was accused of, convicted of, and served a sentence for heinous crimes. And by the way, I think heinous actually has a legal definition, and I don't use it that way. I'm using it in the social sense. I believe it was rape, murder, and something, arson. I don't know. You could look her up. It's Hilton, Hylton. So why on earth did the Democratic National Committee decide to put her in a video at the Democratic National Convention? And the answer to that, I think, is actually really interesting. And I don't know. I have no inside information. But here's, as a historian, what I saw. What she represented was twofold. First of all, it was redemption. It was the idea that if you have served your term in America, if you have served your sentence, you are you are welcome back in society, because Hilton went on to start a major social welfare program. She really has become a major figure in the progressive community, and tried to make up for what she did as a young woman, or what I don't actually know the details of her case. So she was supposed to be a representative of redemption, of the idea that America is inclusive and that you can rewrite your life. So there is that. But here's the other piece that's really interesting. Remember how many people in America have gone to prison. We are living what people know as the carceral state. We chuck people into prison at an unbelievable rate in this country. And so one of the things that highlighting a success story did is it welcomed back into the both the country, but also the Democratic political coalition, people who had served time in prison. Okay, so it was a political act to have her do that, as everything in every convention is. That's kind of the whole point. But here's the next step of that, and that's that, remember, Trump did the same thing. I mean, he pardoned John Ponder, and Mr. Ponder had gone to prison for robbing a bank. Now, it was not robbing a bank, so there was a gun involved. It was not a personal crime like rape and murder or whatever it was that Hilton had done. But it was the same idea, the idea that he is now, because he did his time and he went on to become to start a program for helping inmates transition back, former inmates transition back into society. Trump actually pardoned him at the Republican National Committee. So they're doing the exact same thing. And one of the things that when you see people saying, how could you have this rapist and murderer or whatever Hilton did, look her up if you're going to make this argument. The answer is Trump did the exact same thing. And he did it, I think, not because, and from my point of view, I suspect I'm editorializing here, but there's an awful lot of evidence to this point, not because he really cares about the inclusion of people like Mr. Ponder in American society again, but rather because he really would like some of those votes, because he's desperate for votes anywhere. And he's tried again and again and again, as you know, to pick up more of the African-American vote. And one of the things that the trolls and bots, largely originating apparently in Russia right now, are trying to do is to weaken the African-American vote from its support of Joe Biden. It's why we have Kanye West running sort of a mercurial political campaign, and also the flooding of disinformation into African-American voters. All right, so that's what's going on with that. Let me see what else you guys might want to know here. I do want to talk about the future of political parties, which is people are asking about, but I've only got like 5 minutes, so that's not going to happen. I talked about platforms. Let me see if I'm going to do this one. I wish I could let you guys vote, because there's two that are running neck and neck here. I guess I'm going to go with this one because people might not be as interested in it as they are in other things. So actually, Vicky Lenti asked, people ask, what have the Democrats done? And what I would suggest, I'm not going to go big for the country as opposed to Trump. I'm not going to make a long list here, but I would suggest to you right now, the Republicans embrace that ideology that Trump embodies and that Mitch McConnell certainly embodies, the idea that the government is best when it does nothing, when it just lets those rich guys free to do whatever they want, because that's how you move society forward. The Democrats believe in this liberal consensus, the idea that the government has a role to play in leveling the playing field between the haves and the have-nots, if you will. And so you can divide things through like that. Now, that was not the case until Reagan. That traditional Republicans, Eisenhower Republicans, George H.W. Bush Republicans, those guys also believed in the liberal consensus. They have now been culled out of the party, and they have become the never-Trumpers, basically. That's a little bit of a fudge, but they have become the never-Trumpers because they're willing to, not all of them are never-Trumpers, by the way. I'm sorry, not all the never-Trumpers are traditional Republicans at all. Some of them still believe in the movement, in movement conservatism, but some of them are. All right, so I'm going to take one last question here. and I can let you go, so I can let you guys all go. And this is Laura Eckhard asked me to explain the terms right and left. And I love this question, and I will try to be brief about it. Because actually, I haven't written one of my lectures for tomorrow. I'm giving 2 totally cool lectures tomorrow. One is written, and it is so cool. The other one I hope is going to be as cool, but right now it ain't written, so I got to go too. Anyway, Laura asked me to explain the terms right and left in the political spectrum. How great a question is that? Like the reason I love this question is because, like, right now there's kind of this idea that if you're a Republican, you're on the right, and if you're a Democrat, you're on the left. But what the heck does that even mean? Because Republicans and Democrats have policies, but right and left is like kind of, what does that even mean? Like it's kind of a persuasion-ish sort of thing. And I always have a problem with terms like that. And I'm going to introduce another term here too, which is the term conservative, which I said I wanted to come back here. So what does right and left mean? The actual terms right and left come to us from the French Revolution, as does the idea of conservatism in political thought, which I hope I'll have a chance to tell you a little bit about. Conservatism, small c. And I do have time. All right. So it literally means there's an aisle down the middle of the French Assembly. And the people on the right are the ones who supported the king, and the people on the left are the ones who didn't, who supported the popular assembly. So literally, when we got right and left, right supported the monarchy, left supported the people. The French Revolution is a mess. I mean, every revolution is a mess. I'm sorry. Looking from the front of the stage. So I just didn't give you a direction. So it's to the right of the speaker, to the left of the speaker. People on the right are supportive of the king. People on the left are supportive of the people. All right. So we don't have a king. So, like, what does that even mean, right? The way we get to using these terms now is kind of complicated. So I'm going to give that to you, but I'm going to give you a middle stage first. So the French Revolution is really interesting. And as I say, it's very complicated. And I hate to sound really stupid, but it's actually really important because it does all kinds of things, both to Europe and to America, of course, but also to the way societies think about political power. And that's the only reason I'm interested in it. I hate to say that to all my French colleagues, the people who study the French Revolution, I mean. I'm interested in the way people look at what appears to be, and I use appears to be because I am not a specialist in France, but because that's how that's how they look at it, at least from America and from England, what appears to be a struggle between monarchy, which of course is in real trouble in 1789, because the American Revolution in 1776 said, hey, dudes, we don't need a monarchy. Like, we are all created equal. Now, I'm not going to talk about how the caveats to that, but what really that Thomas Paine's Common Sense does is it says, what's this with a monarchy? I mean, that's just bonkers. And I paraphrase, by the way. And so do many Enlightenment thinkers who begin to talk about the idea of government being a social compact. And that's where we get the real influence of people like John Locke, the idea that, if you heard of him, he says, let's rethink this whole king thing. Mind you, he's not a leveler at all, but he's like, what's this idea of hereditary monarchy? No. So a government is a social compact. And the Americans have written a new government based on the Lockean idea of what a government is supposed to do. So now you get the French Revolution, and the regular people are taking that a step further, and they're literally taking over government, which didn't happen in America. It was a very conservative, a revolution. I don't want to use the word conservative yet. I'm going to give it to you in a second. It's a very socially unrested, not the social order was not overturned by the American Revolution. The French Revolution looked like it was going to overturn the social order through violence, among other things. Anyway, so there's this whole idea out there of what's called Lockean liberalism, this idea that, you have a social compact and that you don't have a hereditary monarchy, and you do certainly have an ordered society, but people like Edmund Burke in England, who had supported the American Revolution, looked at what's happening in France, and he's like, oh, hey, we got a problem here. He becomes known as the father of modern conservatism, small c. And I hate to do this to you so late. I've got like a minute or two left because I do it exactly an hour from when I actually start. Today's people who call themselves conservatives would make Burke roll in his grave. And the reason for that is because when Burke talked about conservatism, and he doesn't actually use that term, that's what people start to associate with him. What he says is like, look at what's happening in France. This is not what we want for a society, because they're actually cutting off people's heads. So what a government should actually do is not govern by ideology. You must not try to govern by ideology, because when you do that, soon the government goes to be enthralled to your ideology rather than having your ideology reflect reality. He says governing by ideology is a mistake. A true conservative in the Burkean sense says do not govern by ideology. Now, what did I just tell you about with Donald Trump and Social Security and the idea that if you just got rid of taxes and regulation and all that, the government would go wild, or the country would go wild? That's governing by ideology. Burke would take a look at that today and say, how are they different than people in the French Revolution? Because in the French Revolution, according to Burke, and I'm not judging the French Revolution, I don't know anything about it, but according to Burke, what's happening in the French Revolution is people are governing according to ideology, and they're killing people, and the country's going to, excuse me, sorry for the word, hell in a handbasket. So don't do that. What he says is that a government's job is to literally conserve. It is to conserve stability. So he believes in institutions that will protect stability. That means the family, church, socially stable communities. And he believes in, of course, in the law, so you can protect property, because you can't have property stability unless people are confident that, their home isn't going to be broken into. So he wants to conserve things that protect stability. And in order to do that, you got to look at conditions on the ground. You constantly have to be saying, oh, wait a minute, that law that was intended to, do X actually did Y. And so we got to get rid of that law and try something else, even though it's not something we wanted to do. If you think about it that way, he would look at FDR as a conservative. He would say FDR is governing according to what works. That is a conservative position. All right, so if that's what you've got there with liberal, traditionally, the idea of keeping the government small in order to make sure it doesn't overawe the individual under Locke, and you have Burke saying, "Oh, let's slow down on this whole keeping the government small and turning people loose thing. Look what it's doing here. We need to conserve what's best about society." So where do we get here today? Obviously, modern day conservatives called themselves movement conservatives, capital M, capital C, because they were a political movement based in that ideology I talked to you about. They tarred everybody else as liberals. I've talked to you about that before. But how do we get back to right and left? We get back to right and left because in the 1960s, after the liberal consensus had taken off in both parties, Democrats and Republicans, everybody, they said, believed in this liberal consensus, a new right emerged. And that new right appeared in 1964 during the presidential campaign of Arizona Senator Barry Goldwater, in which they said that they were pushing back against that liberalism of FDR of the 1930s and the 1940s and the 1950s, the idea that that government had a role to play in regulation and social welfare and building up the state. I'm sorry, and infrastructure. And that new right said that it was going to really sort of weaponize these ideas of family and religion and turn them into a way to fight back against the New Deal state and to destroy that state and take it back to the 1920s. So they call themselves the New Right, even though their conservatism is based in that ideology. It's really quite a sleight of hand. And in opposition to the New Right, we get this broad social movement in America, and it's got a political side as well, but it's basically a social movement in the 1960s and the 1970s that is known as the New Left. And the New Left is less a political ideology, although it is that as well, than it is a defense of people who had previously been marginalized in society. So it tends to be people who campaign for social issues, for gay rights, for African American rights, for abortion rights, for loosening of drug policies and things like that. So nowadays, right and left in America has taken on this weird, right is people who wants to go back to the 1920s, even though they're really not, they call themselves conservative, they're not conservative, and they really don't reflect, maybe they reflect a monarchy, but we don't have one, so do what you will with that. And the left is they call themselves for the people, and as I say, there's a political component of that, but their political goals are really much more within that tradition of the liberal consensus, the idea that the government has a role to play in leveling the playing field between marginalized peoples and those who are not. That was quite a riff, wasn't it? I love this stuff. All right, it's been an hour, my time. I hope I didn't bore you guys. And I hope I got some juice left to lecture double tomorrow. I think I know what I'm going to write in my lecture tonight, though. All right, again, my name is Heather Cox Richardson. I'm a professor of history. I do not speak for my employer when I do these videos. If you are interested in them, I do Tuesdays, the history behind politics, and on Tuesdays at 4 o'clock. And on Thursdays at 1 o'clock, I do a history session. We are currently working our way through the Republican Party, and I think we're up to the Clinton years. I think we're doing the Clinton years. So this week, I think, is the rise of Fox News and the Clinton impeachment and the Starr report. I don't quite know where we're going to go, how far we're going to go. Anyway, thank you for being here, and I'll see you next week. A lot of people are really angry and really frightened by where we are. And I'm going to ask you to usually I just like answer your questions, but I'd like to put them in a bigger framework today. Because what Donald Trump especially, but now the MAGA Republicans are doing, is they're trying to divide the American people into friends and enemies, which is something that happens in any society. I guess I shouldn't say any because I'm an Americanist. It certainly has happened in America before without there being explicitly, I think, an ideological component to that. But it is also something that political theorists have always said benefited the rise of a dictator. So nowadays on the radical right, people are reading a guy named Eric Schmidt, who was a political philosopher who became a Nazi. And he talks a lot about this division of the world into friends and enemies and the use of the state to hurt your enemies. Now, Trump's working really, really hard to make it seem as if the people who support Trump are the good guys, they're the friends, and everybody else is the enemies. And he did this in his first term by weaponizing the use of the word Democrat. So if you think about the way he reacted to the people who were working for the FBI and the Department of Justice, who were investigating his own administration his campaign, his 2016 campaign for its ties to Russian operatives, they were all Republicans. I mean, he'd even appointed some of them, but he called them Democrats. When they started to work against him, he called them Democrats. And, at one point, James Comey, who was the director of the FBI, who was a Republican, actually talked about that and said, this is not the party that I signed up for. And if you remember in the first impeachment, case, one Republican, and that was Mitt Romney of Utah, a Republican senator of Utah, voted to convict Trump on one count. And Trump promptly said that he was secretly working for the Democrats and that he was trying to infiltrate Trump's Republican administration and that he was actually helping the Democrats, which is very difficult to get your head around when you remember that Romney was actually the Republican Party's nominee for president in 2012, less than 10 years before all this transpired. So the idea that he was somehow a secret plant by the Democrats in the Republican Party is, bonkers, right? But you can see this attempt to divide the country in two, the way he has been doing it, really taking off now. He's always done this, but really after the murder of Charlie Kirk, I think just about a week ago, there's been this litmus test that you have to not simply disavow violence, which virtually everybody has. There's always fringe people one place or another, but there's been a real outcry of this is not the way we want our country to go. But to lionize Kirk in ways that simply aren't true. I mean, as people point out, they're not actually using Kirk's words when they talk about how wonderful he is, because he was actually, a real agitator and rabble-rouser, and that's just who he was, So there is this increasing attempt to make this a litmus test. You have to be on our side, and they're going to take anything that they can spin as being offensive in order to create that other group. And you see this, I think, with the Kimmel monologue, which I listened to. I did all his monologues, in which he actually didn't say anything about Kirk, except a couple times to say how heinous the murder was. So, but what he really does is he says they're milking this for all it's worth, and then in those monologues he skewers the president. I mean, he just skewers the president. Like I say, it's interesting to have watched this for me to have watched it, because I had never. I must have seen Kimmel at some point, but I'd certainly never seen his TV show. So I was kind of like what we call in my profession the intelligent Martian, where you're like, what, you don't know the inside jokes, you don't know any of that stuff. So what is your impression? And mine was a pretty honest, this is really about the way he's talking about the president. So they're working really hard to do that, to create an us and a them, and then to use the power of the state against the them, against the enemies. It seems really pretty clear. And you saw last night that Trump posted on social media, or his account did. And I think it's going to be important to remember going forward that he is not always in charge of his account. There's other people who post on there. And so people are often writing, Trump said this, maybe he did, maybe he didn't, but it's more accurate to say his social media account said this. And his social media account said that he was going to designate, I have it right here. No, I don't. He was going to designate Antifa as a terrorist organization. And Antifa is a word that means anti-fascist, and he has claimed since his first term that it is an organized group that is essentially standing against him, and he says standing against law and order. Although Antifa, according to his own FBI director in 2020, is just an ideology of people saying, we don't like fascists. They're anti-fascists, and there's no group. There's no, secret pinky swear or anything. So it's also not at all clear he can make that kind of a designation. But the idea is to say anybody who disagrees with me is one of them. And us good guys all have to stay together. But there's something really interesting in that in this moment. And that's that, think about it. There isn't an us versus them. Trump isn't an us. Trump is an I. It's not like you can say, hey, there's these two contending groups and they want different things and all that. That's not the case here. Trump is one guy who demands absolute loyalty to himself, who is using the government for his own benefit and that of his family and his cronies. And there's all those cartoons about how, the new guy comes in like a toy and he's the best guy. And then, he ends up getting thrown under the bus and then he's moved off stage. The other piece of that is that this construction of us versus them is not true on the Trump side, but it's also not true on the anti-Trump side, which I think is one of the things that has frustrated so many people, is they keep waiting for someone to take over and someone to organize things and someone to push back against them. But there isn't a them. There's a Trump and Trump loyalists, and then there's all the rest of us. And I would like to argue today, and maybe it's just because I spent so much time in the last 3 days with the Constitution, that's actually incredibly American. And it's actually incredibly powerful because, in fact, the United States of America is a really big country. And one of the things that Americans don't like, and that is part of their birthright, is they don't like to be told what to do. And they're not, we're very much joiners. That's something all the way back to Tocqueville used to talk about. As Americans like groups, they like to hang out with their friends. But they're not big, let's all do this as a country kind of people. They're much more individualistic. And so in this moment, you think about the many different ways in which people are pushing back against Trump. And I'm just going to start listing some of the ways here. You have, of course, the lawsuits, and you have people calling their members of Congress and working at the state level and the local level to push back against the Trump administration. But you also have boycotts. And a lot of people have looked for a national strike. And I have never really supported a national strike because, as a historian, I know that in the past, national strikes tend to backfire against the people making them because they are too general and they end up hurting people who don't understand what's going on and feel that they turn against the people organizing the strikes. But boy, do targeted boycotts work. Take a look at what happened to Tesla. Right now, it's not clear what's going to happen with Jimmy Kimmel, in part because people are madly canceling their Disney Channel. And there's a whole list of people companies associated with ABC News and Disney. I'm sorry, not ABC News, with the ABC channel and Disney that are really truly vulnerable to people saying, okay, you don't want us to participate? We're out of here. You have in a number of both national and local levels, and I love this, you have local town meetings, for example, issuing resolutions against the Trump administration, complaining about what they've done, calling them out for things, which I love. Just today, you've had lawmakers arrested in New York City because they weren't allowed in to examine the conditions under which ICE was holding detainees. My point here is that one of the things that I think we're seeing is a lot of Americans protesting this administration in their own way, whichever feels the most frustrating and the most dangerous to them. And that's not a weakness. That's an extraordinary strength, because it's extremely difficult to bear down on 341 million people all protesting in different ways. I want to set up this theory first, this ideological stance. If you stop thinking about the country as us versus them and start thinking about it as the American people versus an autocrat, the lens changes a lot, doesn't it? And one of the reasons that I've been thinking about this is not only because of the smart people I talk to, but because you know who came out against the firing of Jimmy Kimmel last night? I didn't believe it was real. I actually went through and made sure from a lot of sources it was real. Tucker Carlson. And when Tucker Carlson, who was a right-wing broadcaster, talked about why free speech is important, damned if he didn't echo James Madison, which says that, I keep saying this to you, that at the end of this, whatever is coming, the political alliances are not going to be what we expect them to be. And if you disagree with that, look at the fact that two of the other people who have stood up in the last week against Trump is John Yoo, who was the guy who wrote the torture memo for the Bush administration saying they could go ahead and torture people no matter what Congress said, and Karl Rove, who was one of the Republican gurus who put this Republican Party in power. You're starting to see people standing up against this regime from places you do not expect them to stand up. And as an example of where this might go, I would like to point out to you that one of the people standing most strongly for the rights of Americans, including a very recent social media post about the rights of transgender Americans, is Bill Kristol. Bill Kristol, who was a neocon, a neoconservative. We are rethinking our partisanship in this moment around our defense of democracy. And if you think about it that way, and you stop thinking, oh, Trump's got all this power, and then we're the weenies over here, and start thinking about it as what America has always done really well is we the people defending our rights against some upstart who wants to take them away. So try and reframe it that way. And let me push you a little bit further on that. A number of questions here that I'm going to tie into this. Somebody said, how on earth can you say that this administration is weak when they hold all the cards? First of all, this administration is enormously unpopular. A new study out, I think it was today, by The Economist, hardly a left-wing publication, it tends to slide right, shows that Trump has negative 17 points. He is underwater by 17 points. And it also shows that his popularity has gone whoop over the last week or so. He's down real fast, and that's before the firing of Jimmy Kimmel. His popularity is extraordinarily low. And why does that matter? It matters because the American people are not behind what is happening with the administration. And he is underwater on every single issue, including the economy and deportations, which were the two things he won election on. So there is that, the fact that he is unpopular, but you can also tell they know he is unpopular by how hard they are trying to crack down. They are trying to look strong because they do not have control. And again, one of the things I was thinking of when I was thinking about this today and about what I'm talking about, we the people versus a regime. Imagine a room full of fourth graders. Those of you who've had children or have been in education, if you really are in control of your classroom, you don't have to yell. You don't have to, maybe you have to raise your voice sometimes, but you got the guardrails, right? And the students know how to behave, and they tend to behave. If you don't have control of a fourth grade classroom and they're running around like rabbits, there's no way you're going to reclaim control over them. And what often happens is a teacher who cannot control that classroom screams more and more and more and louder and louder and louder. And all it does is it makes the students, some of the students cower, sure, but the rest of them laugh and they turn worse. And all of you know that dynamic. If you haven't had to be in charge of a classroom like that or had a child in a classroom like that, we were in classrooms like that as kids, right? Think about it that way. They're trying to crack down so hard because they know they are losing control of the American people. They're also losing control of Trump's ability to handle the presidency. Watch him. Watch the fact that he was just in the UK, and Melania Trump, the First Lady of the United States, held his hand a lot. She is famous for not touching him. It looked as if he was having trouble. He needed to have somebody holding his hand. He's having trouble articulating things. He's not remembering faces. He is in increasingly poor shape. And it increasingly looks as if the power of the administration is flowing to Russell Vogt at the Office of Management and Budget, who is a key writer of Project 2025, and Stephen Miller, the Deputy White House Chief of Staff, who is behind the immigration policies and increasingly, seemingly other stuff as well. They don't have, and they're not elected officials, and they're trying to do as much as they possibly can, or seem to be trying to do as much as they possibly can, while he is still in charge of the government.